And just treat it like a regular study, though. I mean, just jump in, and if you have any questions or comments, we want to hear them. This is our first night of expanding our audience, and we're glad for folks who have joined us that haven't been with us before. And some other folks might be tuning in. We'll let them in when they get here. And we're going to be studying the Gospel of John for the next, well, it's a 21 chapter book, and we try to do a chapter a night. This first chapter is pretty long. I don't know if we'll get it done, but uh, that's the plan. And so let me go ahead and we're going to introduce the Gospel of John tonight, and then we're going to try to cover the whole thing. So, um, John's Gospel, the intro in chapter one tonight, what we hope to cover. The summary of the book is given pretty well in John 21, verse 24. This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who had written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And so that's what John tells us about his work. It's a true account, and he was a witness to these things. So let's look at the macro outline of John's gospel, the outline of the book. We start with a prologue, and this is a very unusual prologue. He's uh, setting up the deity of Jesus and looks at Jesus' ministry in a really big picture view. It's an introduction that other accounts of the gospel don't have. Then we're going to go on and see that in, I guess, the bulk of the book, the rest of chapter one through chapter 10, he's going to be explaining who he is, revealing who he is in word, explaining it sometimes with words, and then sometimes just in the deeds that he's doing. So, explaining who he is in chapters one through 10. And then we kind of see a transition that is going to deal with life and death. Chapter 11, he's going to raise Lazarus, and then chapter 12, some other things getting close to his cross. In chapters 13 through 20, his self-disclosure in the cross and the exaltation, the resurrection as well. And then finally there'll be one chapter, seems like it was added on, and we can call that the epilogue. And it's a look at the um, well, a special encounter with Peter, I guess you could say. So that's where we're going to be going in this study. Um, the characteristics of John's gospel. Let's talk about this gospel account and compared with the others, compared with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Um, I guess the bad news is John omits much that is contained in the other gospels. So we call Matthew, Mark, and Luke the synoptics. So there's a lot that the synoptics have that John does not have. And a little explanation of that word synoptic. Of the four canonical gospels, three of them, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called synoptic because they can be viewed together. They see it, I guess, similarly in a synopsis, a book that arranges the synoptic gospels in parallel columns. You can see that. Here's an example of one. Um, this example is extracted from the stilling of the storm, but it's on the left-hand column. It shows you can find this in Matthew, and then in Mark in the center column, and then in Luke, and it kind of they have a little bit different accounts, but you can harmonize them and put them in a synopsis like you see here. Um, and so just an aspect of John's gospel. Um, Another characteristic of the synoptics is the order that we find things. They're usually pretty well agreed. Some of them move events around, but generally they flow about the same. So a lot of things that are in the synoptics, John just doesn't deal with. But I guess the good news is John includes much that's not in the synoptics. So he gives us his own view and goes into a lot of detail that the other folks and on some subjects that the other folks don't deal with. Here's a harmony of the Gospels, and you can see in this first column the first row, the pre-existence of Christ. John deals with that, and neither Matthew nor Mark nor Luke do. So he's going to give us some material that is unique that the other three gospel writers don't give us. Um, Another thing that you'll notice is this will jump out at you, I guess, after we've read John's gospel and Matthew, Mark, and Luke. His is just different style. John's gospel is a different style than the others. And we think it was written later as well. And so, with all that said, John's gospel is largely independent of the synoptics. It's a different gospel, a different approach to the gospel than Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Were they written
Um,
about the same time?
he wrote a little after, I think. I think he wrote later, and he wrote later probably um, to to deal with um, some of the problems that had crept in or cropped up after the other gospels were written. So he had a different agenda, if you will. I mean, he was still advancing the truth about Jesus, but there were some other issues he wanted to address. One of the unique things about John's Gospels is the miracles that he relates for us. He's very selective. The other writers have just all sorts of miracles. I think in over 70 are contained in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But John is very selective, and he just puts seven different miracles in there. And generally, the miracles that John records, he's going to tell us more about what happened. He's going to give us an in-depth view. And he's going to give us, in addition to the in-depth view of the miracles, we're going to see him have Jesus have encounters with different individuals, and we'll see more detail about those too. So, a very interesting approach that John has. John is very clear in the purpose of his gospel as well. Um, it seemed like it was almost the close of the book going to be before that epilogue was added in chapter 21. At the close of chapter 20, John said, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." So he tells us right up front why he's writing. It was so we could believe and we could have life. All right. Well, let me stop the share then. That's the introduction to the book. I see while we were introducing, Hamer joined us. Good to see you, Hamer. Good to have you with us.
Yeah. Sorry I'm late. I was like, oh, it's 7 o'clock, 6:59. So I just got
No
finished
worries.
painting. I'm sorry. I was cleaning
Oh,
up.
you're painting today.
Yes.
Jeff,
Bill,
I've got a little bit of a synopsis at the beginning of the chapter. I'm in a study Bible, an NIV,
okay.
and it says this was probably written between 85 and 90 AD.
Yeah,
So I think some of the others were written around 57 to 60 or 65, something like that.
that's right. So, this is nearly 20 years later, John's writing.
So he's certainly able to give us a different perspective then by coming at
Yeah.
it from that different time frame.
And some other things about John, he refers to himself not by name in his gospel, but as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And so there's a connection, a closeness. Sometimes we talk about among the disciples there being an inner circle. In a certain event, you'll see Peter, James, and John given access that the rest do not get. And so John was part of that inner circle. He got that access. And so I think his gospel would be of note just because of that. But another thing that is unique about John, we think John was the only disciple that died of old age, of natural causes. Most, we think the others were put to death, for some reason. So for the gospel. So John's very unique, and his perspective is unique and worthwhile. All right, let me share the screen again, and we'll get started with the outline of chapter 1 and proceeding through chapter 1. The prologue, just fascinating prologue. Let me get started reading. And by the way, dear ones, we usually in this study, I'll ask for readers, and if you're interested in reading, just nod or something when I ask. But I'm going to start reading John chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. I'll be reading from the English Standard Version. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And what jumps out at you listening to those first 5 verses? What strikes you about those?
But the verse 1, the word is God, and she's, and it said the word was God, and he was there in the beginning. So when God created the earth, he said we, and so it had to be God and Jesus, and the Spirit had to be, come say we, just can be God himself.
The plural, yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. Bill?
Well, in my immature understanding of the Bible, I always thought, and it makes sense that Jesus was there in the beginning because we're taught that he is eternal. But in my feeble little mind, I always thought, well, it was when he was born that he became the Savior. But he became the Son of Man then. But he was always the Son of God. So it's
Yeah.
just a little bit interesting perspective that it changes when we see it this way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's funny to think about the things we think when we're children. And I remember hearing the 23rd Psalm as a child, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." And I thought, well, why don't you want the Lord as your shepherd? Wouldn't you want the Lord as your shepherd? That'd be a nice thing. But he means, oh, that means if he's my shepherd, I'm not going to want for anything. Okay, yeah. So yeah, we think as a child, and then we put away childish things, hopefully later.
Yeah, and verse 3 is all things made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. Can you explain that a little more in depth?
I just love the absolute and the absoluteness of that, and the brevity of that. In case you were wondering if Jesus was peripheral in the creation, he just gives you that statement. All things were made through him, and there wasn't anything that was made without him.
Yeah.
Okay, that's everything. He was creator. And so the Bible is very clear about God the Father being the creator,
Right.
but here we have Jesus being creator as well.
Um,
And by the way, maybe we're going a little fast. You know, how do we know we're talking about Jesus here? All it's referred to is the Word. And you know, you can go for a little bit here and not really see where he's going, but it's down in verse 14, you know, just jumping ahead a little bit. We're not there yet, but in verse 14, it's going to say, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And you go, all right, well, that's Jesus then. We're talking about Jesus. It's going to tip it off in verse 14, but you know, you might be scratching your head still. Who is this in verses 1 through 5?
well,
Who'll read verses 6 through 13 for us?
I can read it, Jeff. Even though I don't have my glasses, I'll read it. Okay, 6:30. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. This man came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which gives light to every man coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God.
Thank you. So we're talking at first here about John, and this John is not the writer of the gospel. This is John the baptizer, John the Baptist. Sometimes I use a different word than Baptist because we have Baptists nowadays, you know,
Right.
and it's was John really a Baptist? Well, no, okay, he was a baptizer. He was baptizing people. And he's very clear about the distinction between John and Jesus. John, we think about 6 months older than Jesus. So he was doing his public ministry before Jesus was doing his. But even though he came before him chronologically, John says that Jesus is before him in a very real way, and that John was just there to bear witness to who Jesus was and what he was going to do.
Yeah.
We've got
Okay.
this idea conveyed here that it's not, you know, going to go just perfectly with Jesus. He was in the world, verse 10, and the world was made through him, you know, as we said before, but then the world did not know him. Well, how could that happen? How could the world that he made not know him? Well, that's going to speak to the hardness of the human heart and the way that people, you know, kind of refused to listen to what Jesus was talking about.
Yeah.
And yeah, his own people, it says in verse 11, did not receive him. And that's really unfortunate that he was resisted by some who should have accepted. Now, I don't know, I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but it really strikes me when there are passages in the Bible that seem to say God saves us and we don't have to do anything. And then there are other passages that say we save ourselves. And so you could find some of those. But here in verses 12 and 13, you find them right next to each other. And that's especially interesting to me. Do you see what it says in verse 12? But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. It says there that Jesus gave individuals the right to become children of God. And that puts the onus on the individual. You know, you've now got the right to become the child of God. You make that call. But then the next verse, verse 13, it says, who were born not of blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And so that sounds like God does it. And so we've got this tension, which is it? And we're going to have to read on to see if we can answer that. But a little bit of tension there. Is God doing it, or do we do it?
Hey, Jeff.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah,
one
go ahead,
thing,
Joe.
I used to have a list, and there was about 25 different things in the Bible, New Testament, that save us. I don't think I could find that right now, but I bet you if somebody had a good concordance, they go through that.
I've got a sermon on that, and I think there's about 8 or 10 things that I go through that on the list, maybe more, maybe 15. Yeah, something like that. It's an interesting study. Who read for us verses 14 through 18? Bill, you're muted, but go ahead. Bill, you're muted.
There we go.
There you go. There you go.
14 through 18, right?
Right.
Okay. The word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified concerning him. He cries out, saying, This is he this is he of whom I said, He who comes after me has surpassed me, because he was before me. From the fullness of his grace, we have all received one blessing after another. From the law, for the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and the only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known.
Very good. Thank you. So that just completes the prologue there that we were looking at. And we see the word became flesh and dwelt among us. And it's a very interesting study to look at the glory of God and how it was manifested in the Old Testament times. And to see that glory in human form is what happens with Jesus. And in verse 15, there's that chronology with John the Baptist and Jesus. How could it be if John was born before Jesus that Jesus came before John? Well, that's because in the spiritual side, he's always existed.
Right.
And John's going to, bear witness to that. Jesus is clearly before him in priority and in rank and all. And so the law came through Moses, and grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. There's some passages in the Old Testament that say no one can see God the Father and live. Moses asked to see his glory. And he said, you just can't. I mean, you can't see it and live. But we have seen the Son. And Jesus is going to be very clear to say, now that you've seen him, you've seen the Father. So, yeah. That's the prelude, and that prelude is unique to John's gospel. All right, or the prologue. The prelude to his public ministry, that's verses 19 through 51. Who read verses 19 through 23 for us?
I can read it, Jeff.
Okay.
Now, this was John's testimony when the Jews of Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to ask him who he was. He did not fail to confess, but confessed freely, I am not the Christ. They asked him, then who are you? Are you Elijah? He said, I am not. Are you the prophet? He answered, no. Finally, they said, who are you? Give us an answer to take back to those who sent us. What do you say about yourself? John replied in the words of Isaiah the prophet, I am the voice of the one calling in the desert. Make straight the way for the Lord. Was that where I ended?
So
23?
yeah, that's right. Thank you. So this is John's um, ministry. It's what he's about. And it seems like folks put him on the spot. We know they're going to put Jesus on the spot a lot, play stump the chump with him and try to get him all tangled up. And of course, they never do, but they know that they try. And it seems like they're giving John a hard time too. What are your credentials? What's your work? What are you up to? He says he's not the Christ. He says he's not Elijah, even though Jesus will later say he is the Elijah that was to come. And he's just very humbly saying in verse 23, I am making a path for him. I'm preparing the way for the one who's going to come later. And so he says this is in fulfillment of prophecy as well. Isaiah had said this was going to happen, and he says now it's happening. So I assume they went back and reported that that's what John said. Okay, let me read verses 24 through 28. I was going to share the screen here. Let me do that. So this whole section, 19 through 51, is the prelude to the public ministry. And so this is John the Baptist and Jesus in verses 19 through 28. David read 19 through 23. Let me just read 24 through 28. Now they had been sent from the Pharisees. They asked him, tell then, why are you baptizing? If you are neither the Christ nor Elijah nor the prophet. John answered them, I baptize with water, but among you stands one you do not know, even he who comes after me, the strap of whose sandal I'm not worthy to untie. These things took place in Bethany across the Jordan, where John was baptizing. So he's kind of deferring their probing questions and saying, look, there's somebody coming next, and that's who I'm announcing, and that's who's really important. I wanted to show you a map just here since it mentioned something that's a little bit confusing. This is a map of the New Testament in the time of Christ. And by the way, if you're not real familiar with these maps, a real easy way to orient yourself, you look at the Mediterranean, usually on the left of the map. You see the big Salt Sea labeled here, which is the Dead Sea, down in the bottom portion, the south. Then you see the Sea of Galilee, the other major body of water here, and that's connected by the Jordan River. So if you can locate the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee and the Mediterranean, you've oriented yourself in the Promised Land. Now, off the northern tip of the Dead Sea to the west is Jerusalem. And so that's going to be the main place that so many key events in Jesus' ministry happen. But just to the west of the Sea of Galilee are the places that are going to figure also into Jesus' public ministry, places like Nazareth and Capernaum and Cana that we're going to read about. I brought this map in at this time just to notice that, did you know there are two Bethanys? in the geography here. Do you see here by Jerusalem, just a little bit to the east is a Bethany, and then here, further east, across the Jordan, is a Bethany, Bethabara, which is beyond the Jordan. So the Bethany that I just referred to is here across the Jordan, and that's where John was baptizing. I think it's interesting also that it mentions John baptizing, and they're wondering why he's doing it. This was a new thing. This wasn't part of the law of Moses, baptizing people. So John has introduced a new practice, and they're a little concerned about why he's doing this if he's not authorized. Of course, Jesus is going to say later that he was really authorized. This was of God that he was doing that. So in a way, I look at this as a transitional time. Things are changing. John's baptizing, and they didn't ever do that before. But that's the way he's making straight the path for Jesus. All right. Who will read for us verses 29 through 34?
The next day, John saw Jesus coming toward him and said,
Okay.
"Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. This is the one I meant when I said, a man who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me. I myself did not know him, but the reason I came baptizing with water was that he might be revealed to Israel." Then John gave his testimony. "I saw the Spirit come down from heaven as a dove and remain on him. And I myself did not know him, but the one who sent me to baptize with water told me, the man on whom you see the Spirit come down and remain is the one who will baptize with the Holy Spirit. I have seen and I testify that this is God's chosen one."
Okay, thank you. So this is a section, verses 29 through 34, John's witness to Jesus. Now, he told us he was going to do this, that he was here, or, in his public ministry to witness to this one. And now he lets us know that Jesus is the one and how he knows that. It seems like he knew Jesus was around, or that the fellow that was the Son of God was around, but maybe he didn't know exactly who it was going to be. But he was told, this is how you'll know. You'll see the Spirit descend upon this fellow. And when he does that, when the Spirit descends and remains, that's the guy. And so John says, I saw it. I saw the Spirit descend like a dove, and it remained on him. And so I know this is the one who's going to baptize with the Holy Spirit, verse 33. And this is the Son of God, verse 34.
Hey,
So,
Jeff,
yeah, go ahead, Joe.
one thing I like to say about that is that thing puzzled me for a while, but I often think, okay, if we know, we say, okay, somewhere around here is the Son of God. All these people are walking around looking like regular men. It just shows that how unassuming to me Jesus was, because even John, after he got imprisoned, seemed to have some doubts. Are we sure? And he sent his disciples, remember, to ask him that.
Yeah, I wonder, artists are thinking they're doing us a favor when they draw the beautiful pictures of Jesus. And I wonder if we could even pick him out of a lineup, if he would look very different than what we would expect, and why there needed to be some identifier on him. King Saul looked like Hollywood's version, I think, of who the king ought to be. And you probably could pick him out. He was taller and good looking and all of that. But I wonder, really doesn't tell us too much about Jesus' stature or the way he looked. and there's no picture that survived. Yeah. There had to be some identifier. And so the Holy Spirit is the one that picks him out, pinpoints him, and says, this is the one, identifies him.
So,
All right. Well, that's really John's introducing Jesus. And so that brings us to Jesus calling his first disciples. That's the next thing. So verses 35 through 42, but let's split that up into, well, no, okay, 35 through 42. Let me read that part. The next day, again, John was standing with two of his disciples, and he looked at Jesus as he walked by and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God." The two disciples heard him say this, and they followed Jesus. Jesus turned and saw them following and said to them, "What are you seeking?" And they said to him, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" He said to them, "Come, and you will see." So they came and saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him for that day, for it was about the 10th hour. One of the two who heard John speak and followed Jesus was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We found the Messiah," which means Christ. And he brought him to Jesus, and Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, the son of John. You shall be called Cephas," which means Peter. So the first disciples that we see, attaching themselves to the newly baptized Jesus were followers of John, disciples of John. But John had said somebody else is coming that's more important, and so they just made the shift and went from following John to following Jesus. And that was a perfect transition. That's what they should have done. He challenges them a little bit. What are you looking for? And their question is kind of weird. We want to know where you're staying. Okay. He tells them, "Come on and see." And so they get right into the fold. And then they bring Peter as well, right? Or Simon. We call him Simon Peter, Simon first, Peter after. Jesus gives him a new name when he arrives. So the first disciples, Peter, Andrew. Let's continue on. Let me share again. And we'll conclude this chapter with the call of two more disciples. Who'd like to read 43 through 51 for us?
I read it there.
Okay,
In the chapter.
yeah.
Okay. The following day, Jesus wanted to go to Galilee, and he found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Peter found Nathanael, and said to him, "We have found him on whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." Jesus saw Nathanael coming towards him, and he said to him, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no deceit." Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" Jesus answered and said to him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." Nathanael asked and said to him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel." Jesus answered and said to him, "Because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Most assuredly, I said to you, hereafter you shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man.
Thank you.
Hmm.
So, Jesus is headed to Galilee, and Philip, I don't know, just a chance encounter perhaps with Philip, or maybe Philip was looking, but he um, invites him or orders him, I guess, follow me. And Philip found Nathanael and is just certain who they've found. And he announces it. He says, "We found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, son of Joseph. We found the Messiah." And so I think that's a really good example of not needing to know everything in order to encourage somebody else to come. We just found the guy, but come see him. And this kind of a snide or little snarky comment here. And Nathaniel says, or um, Nathaniel said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" He's from Nazareth, really? Wouldn't expect the Messiah to come from there. But he says, come and see for yourself. And that's always the greatest retort, I think, if somebody's got a snarky comment. Well, why don't you check it out? Check it out for yourself and see what you find. And so there's a greeting that Nathaniel receives, and in Israelite in whom there is no guile or no deceit. That's a character judgment that's made on the initial observation. And so it kind of strikes Nathaniel as odd. How do you know that? And Jesus says, "Well, when you were way far away under the fig tree, I could see you there." That is enough to prove to Nathaniel, that Jesus is who he says he is. And he right there um, identifies him as rabbi and as the Son of God and the King of Israel. So he's convinced of all of that because of Jesus seeing him under the fig tree. And Jesus is a little shocked now. Really? You're going to say all of that just because I saw you under a fig tree? Well, stick around. You're going to see a lot more than that. Just me knowing about you under a fig tree. You're going to see the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. And, that's kind of a reference to Jacob's ladder. Do you remember Jacob's ladder way back in the book of Genesis, with the angels going up and down and ministering to Jacob? Here they're going to be ministering to Jesus as well. And this is an amazing thing. So,
Hey, Jeff,
Bill, go ahead.
I've often thought on that statement where Jesus saw him under the tree. And I've always thought there's a good chance that he at that time was studying or reflecting upon the scriptures and thinking of what, the Messiah is going to be, because they were looking for him. That's just thought that came to my mind often.
That would make sense. That would make sense that he was seeking in some way, and that seeking was rewarded. That's what the Lord says, ask and seek, and you shall receive and you shall find. Bill, what were you going to say?
Um, I from all the studies that we've done over the years, we know that Jesus was a charismatic figure and that he drew people to him, particularly children, but he drew the folks that were the weak and the downtrodden and needed him the most. And so I'm sure that these folks that became his first disciple were drawn to that aura that he had. Uh, you just don't do things like Jesus did and not draw a crowd, particularly back then, because they had so-called magicians. The kings and the pharaohs had so-called magicians that could do magic or do trickery, but they couldn't do the miracles that Jesus could perform. And so I think that he was the kind of a personality that I mean, the lady that just touched his robe, That's such a great story where she was healed because all she did was touch his garment. So
Yeah.
this guy's got he's got some mojo working here. And he doesn't have to flaunt it. It's there. It's him.
Yeah. Yeah. It's genuine. And it seems like there's an ability that's in us, if we use it, if it hasn't atrophied, to discern truth and that which is of God and that which is different. If we're looking for it, we can find it. And I think we're going to see examples of individuals who are doing that and recognize Jesus as that one that, Nathaniel just confessed all those wonderful things about him. Others will as well. Well, that was John's intro to John's Gospel, and then the first chapter of this. And we did get done in under an hour. How about that? That's pretty cool. So for next week, I want to try to do all of chapter 2. Chapter 2 isn't particularly long, so we should be able to do just fine. 25 verses, which is about half of what we just covered. And just to kind of sneak and peek ahead, what we're going to cover in chapter 2, the first miracle, the wedding at Cana in Galilee. We're going to see him travel to Capernaum and keep the first Passover there, the first Passover in his public ministry. We're going to see him cleansing the temple for the first time. And then a statement that Jesus knows what's in us in verses 23 through 25. So that's what we're going to cover for next time. And just as a note, and this isn't really a commercial, I'm not promoting this, but just to tell you, it was back in 2003 that this movie was made. It was a dramatization using the actual scriptures from the Good News Bible. If you ever saw this, you can get it. It's pretty expensive now, and it's kind of hard to find. But it was just people acting out the words of the Gospel of John. The text in the movie is just as though you were reading the Gospel of John. So that's another way that you can experience this beside the study. If anybody buys that DVD and doesn't come back to the study, I'm going to be crushed. But I just want to let you know it was out there. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot,
I,
Jeff.
pre-
Thanks,
Yeah.
Jeff.
I
Thank you,
appreciate
Jeff.
y'all joining. And if you
Yep.
can, join us again
All right.
next
Yeah, good to see everybody.
next week.
Good
Okay.
to see you guys.
Yeah.
Bye.
And thanks to everybody who joined. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care.
Yep.
Talk
Take
to you
care.
Friday.
Yeah.
All right. Very good.
Good night.
Bye bye.
Okay.
Night.
Night, everybody.
Good night.